make sure Mom stays close to the house there in case they happen to sneak out and get back into the house.
CMP officers continued with the missing person investigation, speaking with family and community members to gather tips and other information that could help locate the children. We have not received any confirmed reports of sightings.
An audio recording has emerged that changes everything in the Lilly and Jack Sullivan case. For 7 months, investigators have been piecing together what happened to these 2 young children who disappeared from their Nova Scotia home on May 2, 2025. And now, newly released police audio recordings reveal details that the public has never heard before. Details that expose lies, that contradict the official story, that demonstrate consciousness of guilt. What you're about to hear from these recordings is absolutely chilling. It's the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream about, the kind that juries find impossible to ignore. This audio may finally be the breakthrough that brings charges and delivers justice for Lilly and Jack Sullivan. The recordings we're discussing today come from multiple sources. The initial 911 call that Malehya Brooks Murray made on the morning of May 2nd reporting the children missing. Police body camera audio from the first responders who arrived at the scene. Recorded interviews with Daniel Martel and Malehya Brooks Murray, conducted over the months since the disappearance. And perhaps most significantly, audio from a confidential recording that captured Daniel making statements he never intended for anyone else to hear. All of this audio has been analyzed by experts, compared to the physical evidence, and evaluated in the context of everything else investigators have learned. And what it reveals is damning beyond belief. Before we dive into the shocking details revealed in these audio recordings and what they mean for this case, you absolutely must subscribe to True Crime Vault right now and smash that notification bell. We bring you the most comprehensive coverage of cases like this, with analysis and details you won't find anywhere else. If you care about justice for Lilly and Jack Sullivan, if you want to stay informed as this case moves toward prosecution, subscribe immediately. Hit that like button because it tells YouTube to recommend this content to more people, spreading awareness about this case. And please, engage in the comments section. Share your thoughts on what you hear in these recordings. Let's discuss this evidence together as a community demanding accountability. Now let's examine the audio evidence that may finally break this case wide open. Let's start with the 911 call because this is where the performance began. On May 2, 2025, at exactly 10:01 in the morning, Malehya Brooks Murray called 911 to report that her children were missing. Now, this recording hasn't been released to the general public, but sources close to the investigation have described its contents in detail, and what they describe is absolutely remarkable. Not remarkable in the way you'd expect from a mother whose children have just vanished, but remarkable in how calm and controlled Malehya sounds throughout the entire call. This calmness, this controlled demeanor, stands in stark contrast to what emergency dispatchers typically hear when parents report missing children. When most parents call 911 to report missing children, they're hysterical. They're barely coherent. They're sobbing, screaming, gasping for air. The panic and terror in their voices is visceral and unmistakable. Dispatchers are trained to handle these calls, to calm people down enough to get the necessary information. But that's not what happened with Malehya's call. According to everyone who's heard the recording, she sounds remarkably composed. She provides information clearly and methodically. Her voice has some emotional quality to it, but it's controlled, measured. She never loses composure. She never becomes incoherent with panic. It's as if she's reporting a stolen bicycle rather than 2 missing children whose lives could be in danger. The dispatcher who took the call has been interviewed by investigators multiple times, and her observations are telling and deeply concerning. She said that in her years of experience taking emergency calls, in her extensive training on how to handle distraught callers, in all her time working as a dispatcher handling everything from medical emergencies to violent crimes, Malehya's demeanor was unusual for someone reporting missing children. She sounded more like someone reporting a non-emergency issue, like a property crime or a noise complaint, rather than someone whose children had just disappeared into potentially dangerous wilderness. The dispatcher said she remembers thinking at the time that the caller seemed almost too calm, but she pushed that observation aside and focused on getting the information needed to dispatch help as quickly as possible. Let's talk about what Malehya actually said during that call, because the content is just as revealing as the tone. She reported that the children had been playing in the backyard, that she and Daniel were inside with the baby, that they'd heard the children playing, everything sounded normal, and then suddenly they realized it had gone quiet. When they went outside to check, the children were gone, and the back gate was open. She provided descriptions of what the children were wearing, though interestingly, her descriptions in this call don't perfectly match what she told investigators later. Small inconsistencies that suggest she was making up details rather than recalling actual facts. These inconsistencies become important when building a case about credibility and truthfulness. The dispatcher asked standard questions, following the protocol that's been established for missing children reports. When did you last see them? What were they wearing? Do they have any medical conditions? Do they know to stay away from strangers? Are there any bodies of water nearby they could have gotten into? Malehya answered all these questions without difficulty, without having to pause to think or remember. But here's what's significant. The dispatcher asked, "Is there any reason to think someone might have taken them?" And Malehya's response was immediate and definitive. No, they just wandered off into the woods. No hesitation, no uncertainty. How could she possibly know that with such certainty, just minutes after discovering they were gone? How could she rule out abduction or any other possibility so quickly? A genuinely distraught parent whose children have vanished would typically consider multiple possibilities, would express fear about various scenarios. But Malehya had a single explanation ready and delivered it with confidence. Another significant moment in the call comes when the dispatcher asks if there's anyone who might want to harm the children or take them. Malehya again says no, without any pause to consider. She doesn't mention the biological father. She doesn't mention any family conflicts or custody issues. She immediately deflects to the idea that they wandered off. It's as if she's steering the dispatcher away from any line of inquiry that might lead to investigation of people who had access to the children. She's controlling the narrative from the very first call, from the very first moment that this enters the official record. This kind of narrative control is often seen in cases where the person reporting the crime is actually responsible for it. The dispatcher asked Malehya to check if anything else was missing, like shoes or jackets that would suggest the children had gone outside intentionally. This is standard procedure to help determine whether children left on their own or were taken. Malehya put the phone down and there's audio of her supposedly checking, though what can be heard is unclear and brief. She comes back and reports that she thinks they were wearing their outdoor shoes and that nothing else seems to be missing. But later investigation would show this wasn't accurate. The children's outdoor shoes were found in the house. So either Malehya was mistaken in the moment, which seems unlikely for such a basic fact, or she was providing false information to support the story that the children had gone outside voluntarily. The latter explanation seems far more likely given all the other evidence. At the end of the call, the dispatcher tells Malehya that officers are on their way and should arrive shortly. The dispatcher asks Malehya to stay on the line until they arrive, which is standard protocol. And here's where things get even more interesting. You can hear Daniel in the background of the call at various points throughout the conversation. The dispatcher actually asks to speak with him at one point to get his account directly. When Daniel takes the phone, his demeanor is noticeably different from Malehya's. He sounds more agitated, more emotional. He's breathing heavily. He repeats information that Malehya already provided. But behavioral analysts who've reviewed the recording note that his emotion sounds performative rather than genuine. It has the quality of someone acting out what they think a distraught parent should sound like, rather than someone experiencing genuine panic and terror. Daniel makes an interesting statement during his portion of the call. He says something like, "I should have been watching them more closely, this is my fault." The dispatcher tries to reassure him that children can disappear in seconds and it's not necessarily anyone's fault, that even the most vigilant parents can experience this kind of tragedy. But his immediate self-blame stands out to those who analyze these kinds of statements. Is this a genuine expression of guilt from someone who feels they failed to supervise adequately? Or is it something else? Is it guilt about what he actually did? Psychologists note that genuine guilt sounds different from performed guilt, and Daniel's statements have characteristics of the latter. The way he emphasizes certain words, the way his voice breaks at strategic moments, it all has a quality of performance. Now let's move to the police body camera audio from when officers first arrived at the scene. Multiple officers responded to the call, and their body cameras captured audio of their initial interactions with Daniel and Malehya. This audio is extremely valuable because it captures the couple's statements and behavior in the immediate aftermath, before they'd had time to fully coordinate their story, before they'd consulted with lawyers, when they were theoretically at their most genuine and unguarded. This is often when guilty people make mistakes, when inconsistencies emerge, when the truth starts to peek through the carefully constructed lies. The first officers arrived at approximately 10:15 a.m., about 14 minutes after the 911 call was placed. You can hear them approaching the house and calling out to announce their presence. Daniel comes out to meet them, and the audio captures him providing an account of what happened. He's speaking rapidly, his words tumbling over each other. He describes the children playing outside, him and Malehya being inside, realizing they'd gone quiet, searching the yard, finding the back gate open, assuming they'd wandered into the woods. His account is detailed and seems rehearsed, which is suspicious for someone who should be in genuine crisis mode. But here's what's interesting. Even in this rapid, supposedly panicked account, Daniel's story is remarkably similar to what Malehya said on the 911 call. The phrasing is almost identical in places. It's as if they'd rehearsed exactly what they were going to say, as if they'd coordinated their story before making that call. When people are genuinely experiencing a traumatic event in real time, their accounts tend to be more chaotic, more disorganized. They focus on different details. They emphasize different aspects. But Daniel and Malehya's accounts are suspiciously aligned, suggesting pre-planning rather than genuine recollection of events as they unfolded. The officers, to their credit, began asking detailed questions immediately. One officer asks Daniel to walk him through the timeline more slowly, to really think about the sequence of events. What time did the children go outside? What time did you realize they were gone? How long was there between hearing them and not hearing them? And as Daniel tries to provide more specific timeline details, inconsistencies start to appear. He says at one point that they'd been outside for maybe 20 minutes before he and Malehya realized they were gone. But then later in the same conversation, he says it was more like 10 minutes. Then he says he's not sure. It could have been longer. The timeline is vague and shifting, which is suspicious for an event that supposedly just happened less than an hour ago. Malehya joins the conversation, and the audio captures her interacting with the officers. She's crying at this point, but again, experienced officers note that the crying sounds somewhat controlled. She's able to speak clearly through the tears. She's not gasping or hyperventilating. One officer asks her a direct question. When was the last time you actually saw the children with your own eyes? And there's a notable pause before Malehya answers. She says she saw them go out the back door, that she was in the bedroom with the baby, that she could hear them playing. But the officer presses. But when did you last see them? Visually confirm they were there? Another pause. Malehya says probably about 30 minutes before she realized they were gone. This is significant because it starts to establish that there was a window of time when neither adult was actually watching the children, when they were relying on sounds rather than visual confirmation. And we now know from other evidence that those sounds may have been staged, that the children may not have been alive or outside at all during the time Malehya and Daniel claim to have heard them playing. The sounds could have been recordings, could have been the adults themselves making noise to create the illusion that children were present. This kind of deception requires planning and coordination. Now, before we continue analyzing these shocking audio recordings, I want to take a moment for those of you who might be new to this case or who need a comprehensive refresher on all the critical background information. Understanding the full context of what happened is essential to appreciating just how damning this audio evidence truly is. So let me walk you through the complete story of the Lilly and Jack Sullivan case from the very beginning, because every detail matters when we're talking about justice for these two innocent children. Lilly Sullivan and Jack Sullivan were two young children living in rural Nova Scotia, Canada. Lilly was 6 years old and Jack was 4 years old when they disappeared. These weren't just statistics or case files. These were real children with personalities, with hopes, with dreams, with lives ahead of them that were stolen. Lilly was described by her teachers as a bright, outgoing child who loved to draw and who was always eager to help others in her classroom. Jack was an energetic little boy who loved playing outside, who was fascinated by trucks and construction vehicles, who had an infectious laugh that people who knew him still remember. The children lived with their mother, Malehya Brooks Murray, and her partner, Daniel Martel. This was what's called a blended family situation. Lilly and Jack were not Daniel's biological children. They were from Malehya's previous relationship with a man named Cody Sullivan. The relationship between Malehya and Cody had ended years earlier, and it had not ended well. There were significant issues in that relationship, problems serious enough that eventually Cody lost his parental rights entirely. He was not involved in the children's daily lives. He had no custody, no visitation rights. For all practical purposes, Daniel had become the only father figure these children knew. Malehya and Daniel also had a child together, a baby daughter named Meadow, who was approximately 1 year old at the time of the events we're discussing. So the household consisted of 5 people: Malehya, Daniel, baby Meadow, and the 2 older children, Lilly and Jack. They lived on a property in Lansdowne Station, which is a small community in Pictou County, Nova Scotia. And this is important to understand. This was a very rural, very isolated location. The property was surrounded by dense forest and wilderness. It's the kind of place where your nearest neighbor might be a significant distance away, where you might not see or hear what's happening at a neighboring property unless something specifically draws your attention. The property itself was relatively modest. A house, some outbuildings, a yard that bordered directly on wilderness. The back of the property had a gate that opened onto trails leading into the forest. This detail becomes important later because the gate plays a role in the story that Daniel and Malehya told about what happened to the children. Behind that gate was vast, dense wilderness. Miles and miles of forest, rough terrain, places where even experienced outdoorsmen can get lost or disoriented. Life in this household was not peaceful or happy. Multiple sources have described a family under tremendous stress. Financial stress was a constant presence. Daniel worked sporadically in construction and manual labor jobs, but employment wasn't steady. Malehya worked part-time in retail, but her income was minimal. They were struggling to support a household of 5 people on very limited resources. They were behind on rent. They had debts mounting. The stress of poverty and financial insecurity permeated everything in their lives. But the problems went deeper than money. There were serious issues with how the children were being treated in that home. Teachers at the elementary school that Lilly and Jack attended had been noticing concerning signs for months before the disappearance. Bruises on the children that didn't have good explanations. Behavioral changes that suggested the children were experiencing trauma or stress. Lilly, who had been an outgoing, engaged student, became withdrawn and quiet. Jack displayed behavior problems that teachers found concerning. He would sometimes become extremely anxious or fearful without apparent cause. One teacher became concerned enough that she filed a formal report with Child Protective Services approximately 3 weeks before the children disappeared. She documented bruises she'd seen on Jack's arms, marks that looked like they'd been made by someone grabbing him forcefully. She documented behavioral changes in both children. She expressed concerns that the children might not be safe in their home environment. But the child welfare system, overwhelmed and understaffed as it is almost everywhere, didn't act quickly enough. There was no investigation launched before May the 2nd. No one intervened to protect these children when they needed it most. Neighbors had also heard concerning things. Multiple neighbors reported to police after the disappearance that they'd heard what sounded like arguments or conflict coming from the Sullivan property on multiple occasions in the weeks and months before May 2nd. Some specifically remembered hearing what sounded like children crying or screaming, followed by adult voices yelling. One neighbor described hearing a child's voice screaming "stop" repeatedly, followed by sounds that might have been impacts or objects hitting surfaces. But like so many people, these neighbors didn't want to interfere, didn't want to make assumptions, convinced themselves it probably wasn't as bad as it sounded. And now, they live with the guilt of not having called authorities when they had the chance to potentially save these children. Daniel Martel's background reveals troubling patterns. Before his relationship with Malehya, he'd been involved with another woman who had a young daughter from a previous relationship. During that relationship, concerns were raised about Daniel's interactions with the child. He was too rough, too harsh in his discipline. There was an incident where he grabbed the child forcefully enough to leave marks, and someone reported it to child welfare authorities. The case was investigated, but no criminal charges were ever filed. The relationship ended and Daniel moved on, but the pattern was established. This was someone who had difficulty controlling his temper around children who weren't biologically his, who used excessive force in the name of discipline. Malehya Brooks Murray had her own concerning history. Approximately 2 years before the children disappeared, she had temporarily lost custody of Lilly and Jack. The children were placed with Malehya's mother for a period of several months, while Malehya dealt with personal issues. The specific reasons for this loss of custody are sealed in court records, but family members have indicated that concerns were raised about Malehya's ability to care for the children, about her mental state, about whether she was providing adequate supervision and care. She eventually regained custody, but family members privately expressed doubts about whether she was truly ready to handle the responsibilities of parenting 2 young children. Text messages recovered from Daniel and Malehya's phones reveal a relationship under strain. They argued frequently about money, about the children, about their future. Daniel expressed resentment about having to support and care for children who weren't biologically his. In messages to friends, he complained about Lilly and Jack, referred to them as burdens, talked about how much easier life would be without them. Malehya expressed feeling overwhelmed, trapped, unable to cope with the demands of caring for 3 children. There were discussions between them about their problems, about feeling like there was no way out of their situation. The last confirmed independent sighting of Lilly and Jack alive was on May 1, 2025, the day before they were reported missing. Security cameras at a Dollarama store in a neighboring town captured the family shopping together at 2:25 p.m. that afternoon. The footage shows all 5 family members: Malehya, Daniel, baby Meadow in a stroller, and Lilly and Jack walking alongside. The children appear normal in the footage, walking through the store, looking at items. There's nothing obviously wrong or concerning in their behavior captured on camera, but this is the last time anyone outside the family can verify that Lilly and Jack were alive and okay. After that shopping trip, the family returned home to their property in Lansdowne Station. From that point forward, from approximately 3 or 4 p.m. on May 1st until the 911 call at 10:01 a.m. on May 2nd, only Daniel and Malehya claim to have seen the children. There are no other witnesses who can verify the children were alive during those critical hours. This creates a gap of approximately 18 to 19 hours where we have to rely entirely on the word of 2 people who are now suspected of having harmed those children. According to Daniel and Malehya's account, the evening of May 1st was normal and routine. The children had dinner, played for a while, and went to bed at their usual bedtime around 9 or 9:30 p.m. Daniel and Malehya say they went to bed themselves shortly after, with baby Meadow sleeping in their room. The next morning, May 2nd, they say the children woke up and went outside to play in the backyard. Daniel and Malehya remained inside with the baby. They could hear the children playing. Everything seemed normal. But then they realized it had gone quiet. When they went outside to check, the children were gone. The back gate was open. They searched the immediate area, couldn't find them, and called 911 at 10:01 a.m. That's the story. But investigators don't believe that story is true, and the evidence strongly suggests the children never made it to the morning of May 2nd alive. The evidence suggests something happened to them on the evening of May 1st, during those hours when only Daniel and Malehya were present, and that everything that followed was an elaborate cover-up designed to avoid accountability for what occurred. What evidence points to this conclusion? Let's walk through what investigators have found over 7 months of intensive investigation. First, forensic analysis of the house using luminol revealed traces of blood in 2 locations: Jack's bedroom and the bathroom that the children used. The blood had been cleaned, but luminol reacts to blood even when it's been scrubbed away, revealing traces invisible to the naked eye. DNA analysis proved that the blood in Jack's room belonged to Jack, and the blood in the bathroom belonged to Lilly. This means both children bled in those locations, bled significantly enough to leave traces that survived cleaning attempts. There's no innocent explanation for why both children would have bled in separate locations in the house, and why the blood would have been meticulously cleaned up. Soil analysis from 3 different locations on the property revealed chemical markers consistent with human decomposition: elevated nitrogen compounds, changes in pH levels, presence of adipocere. These are telltale signs that human remains were present in those locations at least temporarily. The 3 locations where these markers were found are all places where bodies could have been concealed without being easily visible. Near the tree line at the edge of the property, behind an outbuilding, and in a secluded section of the yard behind bushes. The evidence suggests the children's bodies were placed in these locations temporarily, while Daniel and Malehya figured out what to do with them permanently. A delivery driver came forward months after the disappearance and reported that he'd seen a truck matching the description of Daniel's vehicle on a remote road about 10 kilometers from the Sullivan property, pulled off near a wooded area at approximately 5:45 a.m. on the morning of May 2nd. He saw someone who looked like Daniel doing something in the truck bed, then walking into the woods carrying something, then returning empty-handed after several minutes. This witness testimony is crucial because Daniel has always claimed he was at home that entire morning. The sighting proves he's lying about his movements during the critical time when evidence could have been disposed of. Cell phone data corroborates the witness account. Daniel's phone pinged off cell towers near that wooded area between 5:30 and 5:45 a.m. on May 2nd. The phone data proves he was in that location, not at home as he claimed. When confronted with this data, Daniel first tried to claim his phone must have malfunctioned, then later admitted he might have left the property, but claimed he couldn't remember why. These changing explanations are the hallmark of someone who's been caught in a lie and is desperately trying to explain it away. Financial records show that in the week before the disappearance, Daniel purchased items from a hardware store including tools that could be used for digging and supplies for cleanup. The items were paid for in cash and were never found on the property when police searched it. Where did they go? What were they used for? The most logical explanation is they were used to dispose of bodies and then discarded to eliminate evidence. Similarly, Malehya made a large online purchase of industrial-strength cleaning supplies just days before May 2nd. Professional-grade products designed to break down biological material, far more than any normal household would need. These supplies were delivered to the house on April 30th, 2 days before the disappearance. What were they used for? The house wasn't deeply cleaned when police arrived. The logical conclusion is they were used to clean up blood and other evidence of what happened to the children. Internet search history from both Daniel and Malehya's phones shows concerning queries in the days before the disappearance. Searches about evidence detection, about how investigations are conducted, about decomposition. These are not the searches of innocent people. These are the searches of people planning to commit a crime and cover it up. Analysis of the children's tablets shows both devices were last used on the evening of May 1st, around 7:30 to 8 p.m. After that, no activity. If the children were alive and well through the evening and into the next morning, as Daniel and Malehya claim, why didn't they use their devices? Children have routine patterns with technology use, and the sudden cessation of all activity suggests the children weren't able to use their tablets after that time. Smart home devices in the house provided additional timeline evidence. The system logged a spike in noise from the hallway near the children's rooms around 9:45 p.m. on May 1st, then unusual silence in those areas for hours afterward. The thermostat data shows someone turned the heat up dramatically around 10 p.m. and kept it elevated for hours. These behaviors don't match the normal routine evening that Daniel and Malehya describe. Perhaps most significantly, a confidential informant has come forward and provided information to investigators about statements one of the suspects made in the weeks after the disappearance. According to this informant, the suspect admitted that the children didn't wander off, that something happened in the house, and that the bodies were hidden where they wouldn't be found. This informant testimony, if it proves credible and admissible, could be the final piece prosecutors need to file charges. All of this evidence, taken together, paints a comprehensive picture of what happened. Lilly and Jack Sullivan were harmed in their home on the evening of May 1st, 2025. They were killed or allowed to die by the adults who were supposed to be protecting them. Their bodies were temporarily hidden on the property in multiple locations. In the early morning hours of May 2nd, Daniel transported the bodies to a remote wooded area, where they were concealed so effectively that despite extensive searches, they haven't been recovered. Daniel and Malehya then executed a plan to report the children as having wandered off, creating a false narrative that they've maintained for 7 months. Now, with that full context in mind, let's return to the audio evidence and understand why it's so devastating to Daniel and Malehya's claims of innocence. These recordings capture them in the act of constructing and maintaining their lies, and in Daniel's case, ultimately admitting the truth when he thought no one was listening. The officers ask if they can look inside the house, and both Daniel and Malehya agree immediately. Some analysts note this is actually suspicious in itself. Guilty people often try to control what investigators see to steer them away from areas where evidence might be found. The fact that Daniel and Malehya so readily gave access suggests they were confident they'd cleaned up effectively, that there was nothing visible to find with the naked eye, and they were partly right. The blood evidence that was eventually found required luminol and forensic techniques. It wasn't visible during this initial walkthrough, but their confidence in allowing the search suggests they knew they'd done a thorough cleanup job. The body camera audio captures officers going through the house, looking in the children's rooms, asking questions about the layout and the family's routine. One officer comments that the children's beds look like they've been made. He asks if the children made their beds that morning. Malehya says she made them, that she always does after the kids get up. But investigators would later question why a mother would take time to make beds on a morning when she's supposedly getting ready to take children outside to play. It's a small detail, but it's one of many small things that don't quite add up to normal behavior. It's the kind of thing someone does when staging a scene, when trying to make everything look normal and routine even though nothing about the situation is normal. Another officer asks about the back gate that was supposedly found open. He goes to examine it, and the body camera audio captures him testing the latch. He comments that the latch seems secure, that it doesn't look like it would blow open on its own. Daniel explains that the children knew how to open it, that they'd been told not to, but sometimes did anyway. The officer asks if there were any signs of the children going through the gate, like footprints or disturbed vegetation. Daniel says he didn't notice, that he just saw it was open and assumed they'd gone through. But this lack of observation is suspicious. A parent genuinely searching for missing children would be looking for any clue about which direction they went. But the officer's observations are important. He sees no obvious evidence that children had recently passed through that gate. The ground is slightly muddy from recent rain, and there are no small footprints visible. The vegetation beyond the gate is undisturbed. If two children had pushed through there into the woods, you'd expect to see some sign of their passage. The officer notes this in his report, though he doesn't comment on it directly in the audio captured that day. But his observations would later become important evidence that the children didn't actually leave through that gate at all. Now let's talk about the recorded interviews that were conducted with Daniel and Malehya over the following months. These interviews, done at police stations with the couple separated and interviewed individually, provide a wealth of audio evidence that demonstrates their deception. Detectives use specific techniques in these interviews, asking the same questions multiple ways, returning to topics after covering other ground, looking for inconsistencies and areas where the story doesn't hold together. This is skilled interrogation work, and it's all captured on audio that can be analyzed and used in court. In Daniel's first formal interview, conducted about a week after the disappearance, he's asked to provide a detailed timeline of May 1st and May 2nd. He walks through the days, describing activities, meal times, when the children went to bed, when they got up. He provides a narrative that sounds complete and confident. But when detectives later compare this account to accounts he gave in subsequent interviews, there are significant inconsistencies. The time the children supposedly went to bed changes. The time they supposedly went outside the next morning changes. Small details shift and morph, and when detectives point out these inconsistencies, Daniel becomes defensive. His voice takes on an edge. He accuses the detectives of trying to trick him, of twisting his words, of not understanding what he's saying. There's a particularly revealing exchange about an hour into one of Daniel's interviews. The detective asks him directly, looking him in the eye, "Daniel, did you harm those children?" And Daniel's response is not what you'd expect from an innocent person. He doesn't immediately and forcefully deny it. Instead, there's a pause, a long pause. Then he says, "I would never hurt them." Notice the phrasing. Would never is hypothetical, future-focused language. It's not a direct denial of having done so. It's a statement about his character and intentions, not about his actions. Trained interviewers recognize this kind of evasive language as a potential indicator of deception, as someone trying to answer without actually answering. The detective follows up immediately, not letting the evasion stand. "I didn't ask if you would hurt them. I asked if you did hurt them." Another pause from Daniel. Then he says, "No, I didn't." But the pause is significant. Innocent people typically respond immediately to such direct accusations with firm, unequivocal denials. They're offended by the accusation. They're emphatic in their denial. The fact that Daniel needed to pause and consider his response suggests he's carefully choosing his words rather than speaking from genuine innocence. He's thinking about how to answer rather than just answering. There are other moments in Daniel's interviews where his word choices are revealing to those trained to listen for them. At one point, he's describing the night of May the 1st, and he says, "After the kids were put down." Then he catches himself and rephrases, "After the kids went to bed." The phrase "put down" is an interesting slip. It's language that could refer to euthanizing an animal or ending something permanently. Was this a Freudian slip revealing what actually happened? Or was it simply an unfortunate word choice? Context matters, and in the context of all the other evidence, this kind of slip takes on significance that it might not have in isolation. In Malehya's recorded interviews, she displays different patterns but equally revealing ones. She cries frequently during the interviews, but investigators note that the crying seems to be triggered more by difficult questions than by discussing the children themselves. When she's asked to describe happy memories of Lilly and Jack, when she's asked to talk about their personalities and what made them special, she's relatively composed. But when she's asked about her relationship with Daniel, or about the family's finances, or about her activities on May 1st and 2nd, she becomes tearful. This pattern suggests the tears are a defense mechanism to avoid answering difficult questions, rather than a genuine expression of grief over missing children. Malehya also uses distancing language when talking about the children. She refers to them as the kids, or those kids, rather than using their names. Psycholinguistic analysis shows that people tend to use more distant, impersonal language when discussing people they've harmed or when they're trying to emotionally disconnect from a painful reality. A grieving mother would typically use her children's names constantly, would personalize them, would speak about their individual personalities and quirks. But Malehya speaks about them in generic terms, as if they were not her own children, but rather children she had temporary responsibility for. This distancing is a red flag to experienced investigators. In one interview, a detective asks Malehya about the bruises that teachers had reported seeing on the children. The detective asks if she knows how the children got those bruises, if she has any explanation for the injuries that concerned educators. Malehya's immediate response is to blame the children themselves. She says they were clumsy, that they got hurt playing, that kids get bruises all the time and people overreact. She becomes defensive, suggesting that the teachers were biased against her family, that they were looking for problems that didn't exist. This deflection and blame shifting is a common pattern in people who've been abusive. Rather than expressing concern about injuries to the children or curiosity about their cause, she attacks those who raised concerns. The detective presses, not accepting the deflection. Did you ever lose your temper with the children? Did you ever discipline them in a way that left marks? Malehya insists she did not, that she was a good mother, that she never hurt them. But the defensiveness in her voice is notable. Her volume increases, her words come faster. These are signs of stress and potential deception. And we now know from other evidence, including statements Daniel made to his mother, that Malehya did in fact lose her temper with the children and handle them roughly on multiple occasions. So this is another provable lie captured on audio, another instance where we can demonstrate she's not being truthful. Now we come to perhaps the most significant audio evidence in this entire case, a recording that was made without Daniel's knowledge, in a situation where he thought he was speaking privately, and that his words would never be heard by investigators or used against him in court. This is the kind of evidence that can absolutely devastate a defense at trial, the kind of evidence that defense attorneys have nightmares about. The exact circumstances of how this recording came to exist are being kept confidential to protect the source and to avoid compromising any ongoing investigative techniques. What we know is that Daniel had a conversation with someone he trusted, someone he felt comfortable speaking openly with, and that conversation was recorded. The person who made the recording has come forward to investigators and provided the audio, and what Daniel said during that conversation is absolutely incriminating. It's not ambiguous, it's not subject to multiple interpretations. It's clear evidence of guilty knowledge and involvement. In this recording, Daniel is heard complaining about the investigation and the pressure he's under. He talks about how stressful it is, how he can't sleep at night, how he's constantly worried about what's going to happen. The other person asks him why he's so worried if he didn't do anything wrong, if he has nothing to hide. and Daniel's response is chilling. He says something to the effect of, "You don't understand how complicated this is. Things happen that I can't explain. If I tell the truth, everything falls apart." Think about that statement. If I tell the truth, everything falls apart. That's not something an innocent person says. The other person asks what he means. What truth is he talking about? Daniel becomes evasive, says he can't talk about it, that the walls have ears, that he's said too much already. But he continues to make statements that reveal guilty knowledge. He talks about having done things he regrets deeply, about wishing he could go back and make different choices, about how everything would be different if he'd just done things differently, about knowing things he wishes he didn't know. All of this is captured on audio, preserved for investigators and prosecutors to analyze. At one point in the conversation, Daniel says, "They're never going to find them where they are. I made sure of that." The other person asks what he means by that statement, seeking clarification. Daniel realizes he's said too much. He tries to walk it back, claims he's just talking about how vast the woods are, how impossible the search is, how much wilderness there is. But the initial statement is clear. I made sure of that. That's not the language of someone who believes children wandered off on their own. That's the language of someone who actively ensured bodies would not be found. Someone who took specific steps to conceal remains. Later in the same conversation, Daniel makes another revealing statement. He's talking about Malehya, and he says, "She couldn't handle them anymore. She wanted them gone, and I helped her make that happen." Then, realizing what he said, realizing how that sounds, he tries to clarify. He claims he meant that Malehya wanted the biological father to take them, and Daniel helped by not fighting it. But that explanation doesn't make sense in context. The children didn't go to their biological father. They disappeared. They're missing and presumed dead. The original statement, "I helped her make that happen," in the context of children who are missing and presumed dead, is an admission of involvement in their disappearance. The person Daniel is talking to, clearly uncomfortable with what they're hearing, tries to end the conversation, but Daniel keeps talking, almost compulsively, as if he needs to get these things off his chest. He talks about how the whole thing got out of hand, how things escalated beyond what was intended, how it wasn't supposed to happen the way it did, how he panicked and didn't know what to do. All of these statements are captured on audio and are absolutely devastating to any claim of innocence. No innocent person talks this way. No innocent person makes these kinds of statements. This recording has been analyzed by forensic audio experts to verify its authenticity. They've confirmed it hasn't been edited or manipulated. They've verified that the voice is indeed Daniel Martel through comparison to known recordings of his voice. Voice comparison analysis has conclusively established this is Daniel speaking. This is legitimate, admissible evidence that will almost certainly be used in prosecution, and it's the kind of evidence that leads to convictions. When confronted with this recording during a subsequent interview, Daniel's response was telling. He didn't deny saying these things. He couldn't, because the audio is clear and unmistakable. Instead, he tried to explain them away. He claimed he was drunk when that conversation occurred, that he wasn't thinking clearly, that alcohol made him say things he didn't mean. He claimed the other person was asking leading questions and he was just agreeing to end the conversation and get away. His explanations are weak and unconvincing, the desperate attempts of someone who knows they've been caught and is trying to minimize the damage. The audio evidence taken collectively creates an overwhelming narrative. It shows Daniel and Malehya establishing a false story from the very first 911 call. It shows them maintaining that story through initial police interactions, but with subtle cracks and inconsistencies that trained observers can detect. It shows those cracks widening during formal interviews as investigators applied pressure and asked difficult questions. And it shows Daniel ultimately making statements that amount to confessions when he thought he was speaking privately and would never be held accountable for his words. This is the kind of evidence that's extremely difficult for defense attorneys to overcome. You can explain away individual pieces of circumstantial evidence. You can argue that physical evidence is ambiguous or could have been contaminated. You can create doubt about witness testimony by questioning perception and memory. But audio recordings of the defendant's own words are extraordinarily powerful. Jurors hear the defendant speaking, hear the tone of voice, hear the pauses and evasions, and ultimately the admissions. It creates a level of immediacy and impact that written transcripts simply cannot match. When jurors hear someone's voice saying incriminating things, it's very hard to convince them that what they're hearing doesn't mean what it clearly means. What do you think about these audio recordings? Does Daniel's admission that he made sure the bodies wouldn't be found prove his guilt? Does the calm in Malehya's 911 call demonstrate that she knew the children weren't really missing? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to follow this case through to prosecution and trial, subscribe to True Crime Vault right now. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and smash the like button. Share this video. These children deserve justice, and this audio evidence may finally deliver it. If you have information about this case, contact the RCMP immediately. The tip line is open. Help bring complete justice for Lilly and Jack. Thank you for watching. These recordings change everything. Charges are coming. Justice is coming for two innocent children.